All right, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar, Navigating the Osteopathic Pathway, a 2022 Guide to Formative Assessments and Initial Certification. My name is Allie Blakewell and I will be your staff moderator today. A couple of things before we get started with Dr. Bowling and Carrie Leo's presentation. This webinar will be recorded and we will be sending it out after today's webinar. For the Q&A portion, we will be saving the questions until the very end. We'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So please put those questions in the chat box when we get there. We will be having Carrie Leo, Paige Linsky, Dr. Bowling, and Dr. Torres here to answer your questions live. And I'll go ahead and get started with the first video.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting the AOBFP to participate in this informational webinar. As you can see, I'm the chair of AOBFP, and our goal for this portion of the webinar is to provide a review and an update on the initial certification process and how EEIC, or Early Entry Initial Certification, is incorporated in that process. So if we can go to the next slide, this slide just simply indicates how many active diplomats are certified by AOBFP. We're 15,000 plus. We offer primary certification in family medicine and osteopathic manipulative treatment. Keep in mind that we are under the governance of the AOA. All of our testing and certification processes must go through a approval process through the Bureau of Osteopathic Specialists and the Board of Trustees of the AOA before they are official. We offer certificates of added qualifications, and those can be found on our website. I won't go into detail there. So the certificates that are obtainable for initial certification include your certificate would read either family medicine and osteopathic manipulative treatment, parentheses OMT, or just family medicine. And we'll detail some of the processes for that as we go through this information session. To note here before we go on, the osteopathic manipulative treatment certification obviously includes passing our performance exam. And for initial certification, this is the only route to certification in OMT. There's been some confusion recently over our proposed alternate pathway. That has no bearing on initial certification, and I will speak to that a little later. But the initial certification for OMT is the performance exam, in addition to family medicine certification. So the applicants, as you can see here on the slide, the eligibility requirements, they're listed under Article 7 of the Policies and Procedures of the Bureau of Specialists. That should be available on the AOA website if you want to refer to that. Basically, the applicant must have completed an AOA approved or ACGME accredited family practice residency program of at least 3 years. Let me explain and define this. There's been some questions over what the 3 years mean, whether it to be eligible for certification, the resident must complete a full 36-month rotation, which involves family leave, medical leave. The AOBFP, the certification process, simply says that the resident must have residency complete status from a 3-year program. So it's up to the program director to certify that that resident has completed all the requirements for finishing the residency. If they have been granted time off and they make up the time, whatever that is, the program director submits that information to the AOA. Once the AOA receives the information that the resident has completed their residency requirements, and that includes any papers or anything that is part of the program. Once the AOA receives that, then the resident is eligible to sit for or to be certified. Now, obviously, they can sit for the certification exam before the residency is completed, but to get certification, they must have residency complete, and the AOBFP or the AOA does not litigate whether or not a sick leave of 2 weeks or 1 month or whatever impacts residency complete. That is totally up to you as program director and your institutional leadership at your residency program to give that resident complete status. So I just wanted to make sure that we covered that, because we are still getting questions from program directors and residents about where they fall. I hope that hope this will clear this up. So then the training program requirements. The AOBFP recognizes only residency programs that are AOA or ACGME accredited. If an allopathic physician, an MD, desires to get Omt certification and they have not graduated from a designated osteopathic recognition program, they must complete the designated hours of approved osteopathic manipulative training. Currently, that's set at 50 hours. So since manipulation Omt certification has been separated from family medicine certification, then if there is an MD that wants to certify AOA in just family practice, family medicine, they can do that by taking our initial certification pathway, either the traditional or the EEIC. If they want to obtain Omt certification and they are in an osteopathic recognized program and it has been documented that they have participated in the curriculum, then they can sit for our performance exam in Omt. If they are not in an osteopathic recognized program or can't document that they participated in that program, and that's the program director's purview of whether they have completed that program, that curriculum. If they have not done that, then they must obtain 50 hours of osteopathic manipulative treatment training to be eligible to sit or attend our performance exam. So that has been a question that has popped up from time to time, and I'm trying to make sure that as program directors, you all understand how that works. As far as pathways for initial AOA certification, and we're talking just family medicine now, not OMT, we have two pathways. The traditional, and you can see it there on the slide, and compare with the early entry certification process. I need to emphasize that, again, an allopathic graduate or an osteopathic graduate can be eligible for our traditional family medicine only certification. If you're in the early entry, you must take 2 AOBFP in-service exams. So again, the alphabet soup gets confusing. The ITE exam is the allopathic ABMS, ABFM in-service exam. The osteopathic in-service exam is the ISE. So it's in-training exam versus in-service exam. It gets confusing, but that's the definition. So if you're in a program for 3 years, you have to take 2 of the formative AOBFP in-service exam to be eligible to sit for the early entry. If you want to take the traditional certification, then there's no requirement to take the ISE or the ITE. Those are formative exams, as you all know, used for residency directors for the purpose of residency directors to assess the progress of the resident. So I want to deal with several questions that have come up along the way. Questions are asked about the long-term viability of our exam, the early entry exam. It's here to stay. We continually review the questions. We continually update the questions in both the traditional and the early entry. Neither exam is going to go away. It's here to stay. So anyone that has questions about the long-term viability, rest assured that it's going to be here for a long time. The osteopathic route is the route designed and made for specifically for osteopathic physicians, and many of the approach to our test construction is based on our age-old philosophy of the osteopathic profession. We've recruited new item writers. A question has come up about the quality of the exam. We have multiple item writers that submit questions to the board. Every question that is submitted is reviewed by the board as a group for final approval. Your AOBFP board consists of 9 members who have long-term experience with test construction, with certification, with the osteopathic profession, with clinical practice, And I'm very proud of our board and the work they do to make sure that our exam is as excellent as it can be. We have a medical editor on board that reviews the questions before they come to the board for grammar, for completeness, for test item construction, and that process occurs before the board reviews the questions. All of our item writers are required to have participated in an item writing workshop so that they understand the principles of question development. And I'm told by our certification director, Carrie Leo, who you'll meet in a few minutes, that we have 60 new questions ready for board review. I can't wait to get to that process and spend a full day reviewing questions for the EEIC exam. But we meet regularly throughout the year, and that's the purpose. One of the main purposes of our board is to it used to be that we had to write all the questions. Now we have item writers that develop the questions initially and present them to the board for final approval. Okay, so I think I talked about the ISE versus ITE on the date of this webinar. If there are questions from the audience, we will field those questions and go into more detail if necessary. But again, the last part of this slide, and I'm still back on the pathways slide. I'm sorry, I'm talking from that. Certification is awarded when AOA receives residency complete documentation from the residency program and all required fees are paid. So even though the resident completes the either the traditional or the early entry, and they have done all the things, if one thing is not documented, if they don't have, if the AOA doesn't have documentation from you as a program director that they have residency complete status, then they will not be awarded certification, even though they've passed the exam. Okay, so now let's go on to the advantages. This was compared side to side, but you can see the advantages of EIC is shorter test, lower cost, and they can take it earlier in their residency year. That's a big advantage because if they should happen to fail the traditional exam, then the next time they can take it would be the fall after their residency is done, and that could certainly impact employment. If they take the EEIC exam in January and fail it, they will have an opportunity then to take the traditional exam in the spring of that year, again, before their residency is completed, and therefore have another shot at not delaying their employment because they aren't certified. So I mentioned earlier that the OMT certification has been separated. So here is the cost of OMT certification. If they take the traditional or early entry, and the cost is listed there, they will sign up for our OMT Performance Exam, and that cost currently is $400. So OMT certification will cost an additional $400 above and beyond the family medicine certification. that's a small price to pay to assure someone who wants to use and bill for OMT that there are no impediments along the way. So that's the process for certification in OMT. And again, I emphasize that this is the initial certification. We will touch briefly on the continuing certification at the end of this presentation. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie Leo, our certification director, that's going to walk you through some of the processes of the exams. Carrie.
Thank you, Dr. Bowling. So for the remainder of 2022, we have 2 exams left. The initial certification exam will take place September 12th through 16th. It is still just a one-day exam, but you have the option of scheduling anytime you would like, and that's over a 24-hour period during that week. We do offer our exam remotely, so there's no need to go anywhere. There's no travel. You can take it from the comfort of your home or office, and it's anytime you like, night or day. The Omt Performance Exam is scheduled in conjunction with the OMED conference in Boston, and it will be held October 28th through 29th this year. Applications for both of these exams are now open on our website. For 2023, the EEIC exam will be held January 23rd through the 27th. The first OMT exam of the year will be held in conjunction with the ACOFP conference in the spring, most likely taking place just before the conference begins, although we're still confirming the dates on that. The initial certification exam, so the traditional certification exam in the spring, will be held April 24th through the 28th, and then again September 11th through the 15th. And the OMT performance exam will be held October 6th through 8th, again in conjunction with OMED, which will be in Orlando in 2023. So we get a lot of questions regarding what's the difference between AOBFP certification and ABFM certification. And in terms of recognition by employers, they're equal. But in terms of the process, it's quite different. For AOBFP, it's 275 questions, and it only costs $550 versus the ABFM's 300 questions, and it's a $1,300 exam fee. So it's a big difference, especially for residents whose programs do not cover the cost of certification. Our annual OCC fee, so the Osteopathic Continuous Certification, what you do to maintain your certification throughout your career. There's an annual fee of $225. And that is for the longitudinal assessment, which we launched just this year. So once you initially pass the initial certification exam, you are never required to go through a high stakes exam again. Instead, you answer 10 questions per quarter for the first 3 quarters of each year, with the opportunity in the 4th quarter to be used for remediation should, for some reason, you not achieve 80% on the questions for any of the questions in the first 3 quarters of the year. These questions are not time limited, and it is completely open book. And we encourage everyone to use any resource that they use in their normal daily practice to look up answers if they do not know the answer. The difference in longitudinal assessment is that once you are certified, we recognize that the exam itself really doesn't make you a better physician, but lifelong learning does. And so that's why we've developed this longitudinal assessment. We're changing the model from an assessment to encourage learning, because that's really what we want to see in certified physicians. Also, in order to maintain your certification, we require you to complete 120 hours of CME credits every 3 years. This is different from the ABFM's model. Their longitudinal assessment requires you to answer 25 questions per quarter, and it is timed. You are limited to 5 minutes per question. And they do require you to complete 150 hours of CME every 3 years. So AOBFP, we have really listened to our diplomates about what makes sense for them and what is reasonable, and tried to make this process work with your busy schedules. The 4 components for maintaining your certification in family medicine: you must maintain an active licensure. It's pretty simple. You're required to complete 120 hours of CME every 3 years. And you should know that for completing longitudinal assessment questions, you do receive CME credits for that every year. So we're helping you to complete 2 components at once. Component 3 is the longitudinal assessment piece that I just mentioned. And component 4 is completing a practice performance assessment once every 3 years. The OCC fee encompasses all of this. So there's no additional fees for any part of completing the 4 components. Dr. Bowling?
So thank you, Carrie. And just in summary, I'd like to go back and reemphasize some things. The question of why should I do AOA certification versus ABFM certification? Here are our answers to why we think that is a good move. The AOA certification exams are designed by osteopathic physicians for osteopathic physicians with the history and the philosophy of the osteopathic profession in mind, regardless of the area of question, regardless of the domain the question falls in. We believe that the OCC process is less intrusive to the physician's life, as Carrie has outlined, through the longitudinal assessment. We think that we have now settled in on a very non-intrusive process, and we think that the overall cost of the process is a little bit less expensive over the long term. Another important thing is that the AOA will support your certification. We've had instances where an employer or insurance company has questioned our certification, and the AOA legal department has stepped in and solved that problem for you. So there should be no concern about whether the AOA, AOBFP certification is going to pass muster with your employer. The AOA has your back. And on that regard, I would encourage you all to encourage the residents to support the AOA through membership, even though membership is not required for certification. I would encourage all program directors to encourage membership and take advantage of other opportunities through that. One thing that we didn't mention about OCC and the component 4, we always get questions about the ACOFP modules, which was a part of component 4. Those are going to go away, but you need to go to the AOBFP website and look for the year of your expiration. Now, you're talking to residents, so the residents should not be involved with this. This presentation was primarily on EEIC and initial certification, but I'm sure there's going to be some residents say, well, what about these component 4 modules. They shouldn't come into play for the current residents this year or beyond. So I just wanted to speak to that and clarify it. So bottom line, I first certified in 1978. I've recertified 4 times under the old processes. I'm very proud of my AOA certification. I'm proud that I can be part of a profession that is leading the way on inclusiveness, in patient involvement in our care. We have always been a profession that talks to patients. We don't treat symptoms, but we treat patients. And that's important to include the patient as part of the treatment team. And I think with that background in philosophy, our certification process supports that and is just, I think, the certification process of choice for all DOs, and we certainly welcome allopathic physicians to be certified under the rules of our certification process. So thank you for the time, but I'm available through the AOBFP office if you need to contact or want to contact me as chair. I'll be glad to interact with you in any way that I can be helpful. So again, thank you for the time and the invitation. And we hope that this has been helpful and has clarified and cleared up some of the questions that you all have had. Have a great day.
I am now going to play Dr. Henwood's presentation.
Hello, I'm Carol Henwood, the Vice President of the ACOFP Education and Research Foundation and Chair of the Forging Our Osteopathic Future program. And I'll be speaking to you today about the Initial Certification Fund. Next slide. As the non-for-profit arm of the American College of Osteopathic Family Physicians, the mission of the ACOFP Foundation is to encourage understanding of the principles and practices of osteopathic family medicine, to promote osteopathic family physician leadership, and to promote public health improvements. Founded in 1986, the foundation is the largest focused on the healthcare of communities and patients cared for by nearly 18,000 osteopathic family physicians across our nation. The ACOFP Foundation envisions a world where osteopathic family medicine is regarded as leaders on positive patient experience, improved public health, and the reduction of per capita cost of healthcare. Next slide. The battle for osteopathic distinctiveness has been a reality since the 1960s. And today, we feel that all efforts must be taken to ensure the long-term viability of our specialty. Osteopathic family physicians play a critical role in the healthcare continuum, especially in rural and underserved communities. Given the increasing physician shortage, health disparities, and need for primary care in our communities, support for osteopathic family medicine is needed now more than ever. To strengthen the next generation of osteopathic physicians, the foundation is seeking to raise $2 million through the Forging Our Osteopathic Future fundraising campaign. This campaign supports third-year residents obtaining their cognitive and practical osteopathic certifications through the American Osteopathic Board of Family Physicians to ensure osteopathic distinctiveness. Next slide. This grant is immensely important to me, says DeAndre Dwyer, DO, because it allows me to continue the long-held tradition of osteopathy. You can read his other statements there, but the certification fund offers $1,400 to each resident taking both their practical and cognitive exams, $900 for the exam fees, and an estimated $500 for expenses to travel to the practical exam. It is our estimate that 30% of institutions where family medicine residencies are held are not reimbursing residents for exam fees and travel. Next slide. It means a lot to me, even at this stage in our career, where we have gone through undergraduate, gone through school, medical school, and are nearing the end of our residency, that someone is out there thinking of us residents, said Elizabeth George Dio. It is well known that approximately $250,000 of debt awaits osteopathic medical students related to osteopathic medical education alone, and an average of 13 years to pay off student debt exists. Funding this $1,400 to the residents through the foundation eliminates the financial barriers of obtaining AOBFP certification, specifically in OMT. Next slide. Since the inception of the fund in 2020, the ACOFP Foundation has awarded 264 initial certification grants to qualifying third-year osteopathic family medicine residents from 33 states, totaling $369,600 in funding. You can see the breakdown over the first several years, and it is our hope that this fund will be used for certification grants for a 10-year period of time. Next slide. As I said, the foundation will cover grants totaling $1,400 per resident. To be eligible, a physician must be a third-year resident, member of the ACOFP, planning to sit for the American Osteopathic Board of Family Physicians written exam and OMT practical. Applicants for either AOBFP early entry certification or traditional certification pathway are encouraged to apply. To qualify for grants, candidates must not receive financial support from their residency program sufficient to cover the cost of the AOBFP exam and travel. Next slide. You have before you the 3-year data that discusses where the total grant awardees are from, broken down by states, and many, many blue states exist. We're hoping that at some interval, all of the map of our country will be blue. Next slide. The next steps in this cycle are that the applications for the fall funding will open in July, and applications for the spring 2023 funding cycle will follow shortly thereafter. What can you do to help preserve our osteopathic distinctiveness and help forge our osteopathic future? Please share the program information with the residents and with your colleagues. There's an email to contact our staff coordinator to help ready to receive and share the information for you. Encourage your residents to apply. Promote the grant program through relevant communication and outlets, either at your program in your states or at a medical school that you may be affiliated. You can also ask your state or local AOA affiliate organization to share information with its members. And last but not least, you can certainly consider donating to support this important initiative. We are at $1.9 million and hope to be reaching our $2 million goal shortly, so that we can sustain, as I said, the 10-year grant program. And you may support this through the ACOFP Foundation.org/donate website that you see on the slide. Next step. You'll see before you all of our partners, our state societies, our comms, our industry partners, all of whom believe that osteopathic family physicians should be the way of the future. And they are joining us so that their road in osteopathic family medicine will be less rocky than the one that we have traveled. And we thank them for all of their support. Next slide. Here's the contact information for myself and for Paige Zelensky, our Program and Development Manager. You can reach out to us directly, and we really hope that you will consider all of the asks that I have in this short webinar and be a part of forging our osteopathic future. Thank you.
All right, and next up, I want to pass it over to Dr. Torres.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to pull up my slides for just one moment. So good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. I know it's been a lot of information, and the purpose of my discussion will be to discuss the formative assessment our residents complete and how that helps prepare them for initial certifying exams. So we're going to discuss predictability for board pass rate based on our in-service examination training. And then we're going to discuss our residency training exams offered through the ACOFP and AOBFP. Excuse me one second. There we go. So report on our predictability. So what we did trying to assess this was really a several years process trying to provide reliable information to correlate performance on the residency in-service examination and performance subsequently on the certifying exam through AOBFP. And so the framework for this study was established through O'Neill, who had published 2 studies that were fairly large looking at comparable statistics for ABFM passage rate. And the study metrics that they focused their study on and that have been really received the most by program directors have been looking at very familiar statistics: positive predictive value, negative predictive value, specificity, and sensitivity, along with some others that are a little more specific for psychometric test analysis. We also looked at correlations looking between exam pairs. So we wanted to get a sense during the course of a residency's training, first, second, third year, was there a difference in how predictive that was of ultimate board passage rate? And so we examined almost 1,900 residents and followed them from PGY1 through their PGY3 year, focusing on those who took their AOBFP certifying exam between 2016 and 2018. We did correlational analysis looking at essentially 2 areas. So one was a correlation among in-service exam scores across the 3 years, especially with a focus of postgraduate medical education. And secondly, correlating in-service exam performance with board certification scores. So as you can see from this chart representation, it had very good correlation really across PGY1, PGY2, PGY3 years. If you remember back from our inclusion, you can see why there are so many more black dots under the PGY3 year, is that this included all 3 years of the certifying exams, whereas only one group was a PGY1 over the course of those years that we analyzed. So looking at traditional psychometric measures of looking through correlation between disparate examinations, usually what we rely on are these reliability numbers. And as you can see here from our statistics, there's a very good correlation between performance on in-service exam and ultimate performance on the certifying exam, with our PGY2s and PGY3s really having very strong correlations to certifying rate, but also even in PGY1, that there was a good correlation from PGY1 of ultimate performance. So really this translates across their residency training. And as you can see from the double asterisks, most of these had a p-value that was less than 0.01, making them very strongly significant. For comparison, our ABFM correlations that we were looking at was also in the 0.6 range. So, like I mentioned earlier, the other metrics that are more commonly used are going to be more familiar to us as program directors. They're included on the in-service exam and our AOBFP certifying exam, which is looking at our positive predictive value and negative predictive value. So just a really quick refresher, because I am certain that those on the call already know this, but looking at the ACOFP in-service exam performance, what we did was we artificially created a failure being the bottom 10th percentile. This is artificial because, as you know, this is really an exam that is formative. There's not really a pass-fail, but certainly if you're in the bottom 10%, there's some room to be made up. So we drew the line at 10%, which correlates very closely with the 12% that ABFM used. And then we compared performance of whether or not they went on to pass or fail their certifying examination. And what you can see is that for those residents who performed in the upper 90% of test takers, 99% of them went on to pass the AOBFP certifying exam. Interestingly, of those bottom 10%, if we look at their ultimate performance, you can see that the vast majority of them also went on to pass the certifying examination. And we'll discuss that in just a little bit. But for, again, comparison, because a lot of our program directors asked for an apples to apples comparison. The ITE to ABFM numbers were very comparable to the numbers that we achieved. And so what does this all mean? Well, looking at our predictive value, as I mentioned earlier, PGY 1, 2, 3, all of them are 99% predictive. So if your interns are performing above the bottom 10%, they're very likely to go on to be successful passing the exam. If they're not, the information that they get can be valuable in helping to form an effective remediation strategy. And so in closing, our exam is 99% predictive for passing the AOBFP certifying exam. So what does that mean? Well, both the ACOFP in-service exam is really highly predictive of passing the AOBFP certifying exam, and the AFP in-service training exam is predictive of passing their certifying exam. And so essentially, they both predict really well. And so at the end of the day, from a correlation perspective, the data shows that the in-service exam should be chosen that the resident plans to ultimately take, because it's going to provide them with the most actionable information. The main differences between the two are those that Dr. Bowling really discussed earlier, which is that early entry does allow for residents to certify earlier and more affordably. The training does fulfill osteopathic recognition requirements, and the optional OMT practical helps preserve OMT practice rights, even for MD residents who are eligible to sit for our examination after completing an osteopathically recognized residency program. For those interested, this article, it has been submitted and accepted for print, and it will be appearing in the Journal of Family Medicine, although we're awaiting a final date for which month they will be publishing this information. A brief review of the training examinations that we have. So we have two examinations that are offered through the ACOFP. We have our in-service exam, which is 265 questions, including 190 general family medicine questions and 75 questions dedicated to osteopathic principles and practice and OMM. Those OPP-OMM questions are also offered separately through the Cortex examination. So both of these do meet that requirement for osteopathic recognition, having an assessment tool to assess knowledge in osteopathic principles and practices. But as mentioned earlier, the basic requirement for assessment of family medicine knowledge, the in-service exam is really the only one that fulfills that requirement. Looking at the questions and the price, what you can see here is actually that it's more favorable for us to do the in-service examination than the Cortex examination for our family medicine programs. The Cortex examination is available to our fellow specialties. So we have had residents in pediatrics, obstetrics, internal medicine, dermatology sit for the Cortex examination over the years. So it is available outside of our specialty, which is really the place where we were hoping that it would be used more. A summary of performance over the last year, what we can see is that almost 200 programs used our in-service examination product, while only 85 programs used the Cortex, which was delivered last year through that Catalyst online platform. In terms of the progress made by our committees, even without any in-person meetings, just completely virtual, we had 42 new questions that were generated for our in-service exam and 33 new questions for our Cortex exam. In terms of quality, because that's always a question, it is predictive and valuable from that perspective, but how well are the questions written? And looking at our reliability, what we can see is that our in-service and Cortex exams reliability are both above 0.8, which is consistent with a highly reliable examination that effectively tests what it intends to and discriminates between whether somebody guessed or actually knew the information. And that concludes my presentation today. Oh, just a discussion of the timing. So the Catalyst platform, we did have a little more time available via the Catalyst platform while residents got familiar with that process.
Thank you so much, Dr. Torres and Dr. Bowling and Carrie for your presentations today. We do have a few minutes here for some questions, and I saw that Carrie and Dr. Bowling were answering some in the Q&A box as the presentations were going. So we did have a couple questions that came in prior to the webinar. So I'll just ask a few of them here. And again, if you already answered them, I apologize. So please let me know. Is there a path for MDs on an ORT to pursue osteopathic board certification?
Say that again.
Sorry. Is there a path for MDs on an ORT to pursue osteopathic board certification?
Yes, if an allopathic physician is in an osteopathic recognized program and they document that they actually participated in the osteopathic curriculum, the OMT curriculum, then they can sit for our certification and the OMT performance. If they are in a non-osteopathic training program, they can still take our family medicine certification. They just can't take the OMT certification without an additional 50 hours of documented training in OMT. Does that answer the question?
I'm not sure who asked it, so if they're on here, hopefully they'll let us know.
Harry, anything to add to that?
No, I think you answered it perfectly.
Great, thank you. We did have one come through the chat here. Can an osteopathic physician that attended an allopathic residency obtain AOBFP certification?
Absolutely. any student that graduates from an osteopathic school can sit for the ISE in-service training exams and our certification. The reasoning there is they've had 4 years of training in OPP and OMM and OMT, and so they can immediately enter into the AOA family medicine certification process. As program directors, I would encourage you all to encourage especially your osteopathic graduates to take the ISE in-service exam during residency to prepare them for that early entry. Even if they don't do that, if the program forces them, might be a little strong, but if they're required to take the allopathic ITE exam, they can still sit for our traditional certification exam in the spring and apply and take the performance exam in the spring. That's open to all osteopathic graduates.
Thank you. If EIC exam is failed, does that count towards a program's pass rate?
I would defer that to Dr. Torres, I think.
So I would say yes, because it is a genuine effort towards certification. Then it would be reported as a failure. But that is with the caveat that I don't have an idea of the inner workings of ACGME. But it is a exam through which a resident would be able to get certification, so it should count.
And keep in mind what I said earlier, if they do fail the EEIC exam, they still have the opportunity of taking the traditional exam that spring before they finish residency. But as far as our certification board, we don't have any jurisdiction in the decision of whether the evaluation of the residency programs. That would be under the ACGME process. Correct, Jonathan?
Yes. And then further, to be eligible for the EEIC, they would have had to take the in-service 2 times, which, as we discussed, the correlation is incredibly predictive of performance.
Correct.
So if a resident performed in the bottom 10 percentile on the most recent in-service exam, and there was legitimate concern for failure, then remediation and possibly holding out for additional study time might be reasonable. But as you can see, even those who performed poorly ultimately passed the first time, most of the 96% of the time.
Thank you. Is there a specific mechanism to document that an MD resident has completed 50 hours of OMT?
We don't have any specific requirements for what they have to complete. I think if they just submit certificates of completion from whatever activities they've done, that will be accepted.
Thank you. And would you please clarify regarding MD residents taking OMT practical? Can MD residents take only the OMT practical with 50 hours of OMT if they elect to take the ABFM cognitive exam?
No, I answered that on a chat earlier. Somebody asked that question. In order to be certified in OMT, they must have AOA family medicine certification. It's not a even though it's separated, it's not a standalone certification. It's paired. You must be certified in family medicine by AOA in order to become certified and have the OMT added to your certificate.
Great, thank you. I think we'll have time for just one more here. And again, if you answered this, I'm sorry. What is being done to simplify MOC activities? ABFM is more straightforward in how MOC proceeds.
I'm not totally familiar with the MOC, Maintenance and Certification. That's the allopathic equivalent to our OCC. As Carrie outlined, longitudinal assessment, I don't see how you can get it any more simple and straightforward than what we have made it. Initially, OCC was very complex and complicated. It's evolved. There's been a lot of discussion and improvement, and as Carrie outlined, the whole concept of change has changed away from just final assessment to emphasizing lifelong learning. And 10 questions a quarter for 3 quarters out of the year, and one practice improvement project every 3 years. How much simpler can we make it? I don't think that it's really that onerous. I just saw something in the chat.
So actually it's not quite in existence yet. It is something that is being developed. It's called the Pathway 2 for OMT certification. It is not yet available to have OMT almost as its own standalone exam. There will be more information on that forthcoming probably in the spring.
Well, let me just clarify. There's been a lot of questions about our OMT certification along with family medicine. And on our website, it does say that there is an alternative pathway for OMT, and it would be available hopefully this year. We have finally gotten approval from the AOA Board of Trustees that the OCC part of OMT, once you've passed the performance exam and got your initial certification, you have 2 options now to maintain that certification. You can continue to take the performance exam at toward the end of your certification 9-year period, or you can complete 8 hours of OMT workshop training under the curriculum guidelines approved by the AOBFP. Now, both pathways with this approval, both pathways will require a longitudinal assessment module specifically in OMT. For OCC and family medicine, if you take the 9 years, 3 modules, 10 questions a quarter, I shouldn't use modules because that's going to get confused with the ACOFP modules. That's not what I'm talking about. The 10 questions per quarter, that's 30 per year times 9 is 270, or 27 components, 27 quarters. If you want to maintain an OMT certification, regardless of whether you do the workshop route or the performance exam route, one of those modules every 3 years will have to be an OMT module. So there will be 10 questions on your longitudinal assessment specifically out of an OMT module. That has been approved, and that will be the process going forward. That doesn't address the original question about other specialties, et cetera. But as far as AOBFP certification, and I can't speak to what other specialty boards will determine and how they will incorporate OMT certification into their specialty. That's not AOBFP's jurisdiction, but for osteopathic family medicine certification, there are now 2 pathways, and I'm working on a letter, an information to get that out. But just to let you know, that pathway has been approved.
Thank you so much for answering that question. That is all the time we have for questions today. Again, I wanted to thank you all so much for presenting and everyone for joining us. Again, we will be sending out a recording of the webinar once this concludes, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.